Chapter 21. The state of Roberta's mind for that night is not easily to be described. For here was true and poignant love, and in youth true and poignant love is difficult to withstand. Besides, it was coupled with the most stirring and grandiose allusions in regard to Clyde's local material and social condition, allusions which had little to do with anything he had done to build up, but were based rather on conjecture and gossip over which he had no control. And her own home, as well as her personal situation, was so unfortunate, no promise of any kind save in his direction. And here she was quarreling with him, sending him away angry. On the other hand, was he not beginning to push too ardently toward those troublesome and no doubt dreadful liberties and familiarities which her morally trained conscience would not permit her to look upon as right? How was she to do now? What to say? Now it was that she said to herself in the dark of her room, after having slowly and thoughtfully undressed and noiselessly crept into the large, old-fashioned bed. "No, I won't do that. I mustn't. I can't. I will be a bad girl if I do. I should not do that for him even though he does want me to, and should threaten to leave me forever in case I refuse. He should be ashamed to ask me." And at the very same moment, or the next, she would be asking herself what else under the circumstances they were to do. For most certainly Clyde was at least partially correct in his contention that they had scarcely anywhere else they could go and not be recognized. How unfair was that rule of the company! And no doubt apart from that rule, the Griffiths would think it beneath him to be troubling with her, as would no doubt the Newtons and the Gilpins for that matter, if they should hear and know who he was. And if this information came to their knowledge it would injure him and her. And she would not do anything that would injure him, never. One thing that occurred to her at this point was that she should get a place somewhere else so that this problem should be solved, a problem which at the moment seemed to have little to do with the more immediate and intimate one of desiring to enter her room. But that would mean that she would not see him any more all day long, only at night. And then not every night by any means. And that caused her to lay aside this thought of seeking another place. At the same time as she now meditated, the dawn would come tomorrow and there would be Clyde at the factory. And supposing that he should not speak to her nor she to him. Impossible. Ridiculous. Terrible. The mere thought brought her to a sitting posture in bed, where distractedly a vision of Clyde looking indifferently and coldly upon her came to her. On the instant she was on her feet and had turned on the one incandescent globe which dangled from the center of the room. She went to the mirror hanging above the old walnut dresser in the corner and stared at herself. Already she imagined she could see dark rings under her eyes. She felt numb and cold and now shook her head in a helpless and distracted way. He couldn't be that mean. He couldn't be that cruel to her now, could he? Oh, if he but knew how difficult, how impossible was the thing he was asking of her. Oh, if the day would only come so that she could see his face again. Oh, if it were only another night so that she could take his hands in hers, his arm, feel his arms about her. "Clyde, Clyde," she exclaimed half aloud, "you wouldn't do that to me, would you?" "You couldn't." She crossed to an old, faded and somewhat decrepit overstuffed chair which stood in the center of the room beside a small table whereon lay some nondescript books and magazines, the Saturday Evening Post, Munsey's, the Popular Science Monthly, Beebe's Garden Seeds, and to escape most distracting and searing thoughts, sat down, her chin in her hands, her elbows planted on her knees. But the painful thoughts continuing and a sense of chill overtaking her, she took a comforter off the bed and folded it about her, then opened the seed catalogue, only to throw it down. No, 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 he couldn't do that to me, he wouldn't. She must not let him. Why, he had told her over and over that he was crazy about her, madly in love with her. They had been to all these wonderful places together. And now, without any real consciousness of her movements, she was moving from the chair to the edge of the bed, sitting with elbows on knees and chin in hands, or she was before the mirror or peering restlessly out into the dark to see if there were any trace of day. And at 6, and 6:30 when the light was just breaking and it was nearing time to dress, she was still up, in the chair, on the edge of the bed, in the corner before the mirror. But she had reached but one definite conclusion, and that was that in some way she must arrange not to have Clyde leave her. That must not be. There must be something that she could say or do that would cause him to love her still, even if she must let him stop in here or somewhere from time to time, some other room in some other rooming house maybe, where she could arrange in some way beforehand, say that he was her brother or something. But the mood that dominated Clyde was of a different nature. To have understood it correctly, the full measure and obstinacy and sullen contentiousness that had suddenly generated, one would have had to return to Kansas City and the period in which he had been so futilely dancing attendance upon Hortense Briggs. Also his having been compelled to give up Rita, yet to no end. For, although the present conditions and situation were different, and he had no moral authority wherewith to charge Roberta with any such unfair treatment as Hortense had meted out to him, still there was this other fact that girls, all of them, were obviously stubborn and self-preservative, always setting themselves apart from and even above the average man, and so wishing to compel him to do a lot of things for them without their wishing to do anything in return. And had not Ratterer always told him that in so far as girls were concerned he was more or less of a fool, too easy, too eager to show his hand and let them know that he was struck on them? Whereas, as Ratterer had explained, Clyde possessed the looks, the goods, and why should he always be trailing after girls unless they wanted him very much? And this thought and compliment had impressed him very much at that time. Only because of the fiascos in connection with Hortense and Rita he was more earnest now. Yet here he was again in danger of repeating or bringing upon himself what had befallen him in the case of Hortense and Rita. At the same time he was not without the self-incriminating thought that in seeking this, most distinctly he was driving toward a relationship which was not legitimate and that would prove dangerous in the future. For, as he now darkly and vaguely thought, if he sought a relationship which her prejudices and her training would not permit her to look upon as anything but evil, was he not thereby establishing in some form a claim on her part to some consideration from him in the future which it might not be so easy for him to ignore? For after all he was the aggressor, not she. And because of this, and whatever might follow in connection with it, might not she be in a position to demand more from him than he might be willing to give? For was it his intention to marry her? In the back of his mind there lurked something which even now assured him that he would never desire to marry her, could not in the face of his high family connections here. Therefore should he proceed to demand, or should he not? And if he did, could he avoid that which would preclude any claim in the future? He did not thus so distinctly voice his inmost feelings to himself, but relatively of such was their nature. Yet so great was the temperamental and physical enticement of Roberta that in spite of a warning nudge or mood that seemed to hint that it was dangerous for him to persist in his demand, he kept saying to himself that unless she would permit him to her room, he would not have anything more to do with her, the desire for her being all but overpowering. This contest which every primary union between the sexes, whether with or without marriage implies, was fought out the next day in the factory. And yet without a word on either side. For Clyde, although he considered himself to be deeply in love with Roberta, was still not so deeply involved but that a naturally selfish and ambitious and seeking disposition would in this instance stand its ground and master any impulse. And he was determined to take the attitude of one who had been injured and was determined not to be friends any more or yield in any way unless some concession on her part, such as would appease him, was made. And in consequence he came into the stamping department that morning with the face and air of one who was vastly preoccupied with matters which had little, if anything, to do with what had occurred the night before. Yet, being far from certain that this attitude on his part was likely to lead to anything but defeat, he was inwardly depressed and awry. For, after all, the sight of Roberta, freshly arrived, and although pale and astray, as charming and energetic as ever, was not calculated to assure him of any immediate or even ultimate victory. And knowing her as well as he thought he did, by now, he was but weakly sustained by the thought that she might yield. He looked at her repeatedly when she was not looking. and when in turn she looked at him repeatedly, but only at first when he was not looking, later when she felt satisfied that his eyes, whether directly bent on her or not, must be encompassing her, still no trace of recognition could she extract. And now to her bitter disappointment, not only did he choose to ignore her, but quite for the first time since they had been so interested in each other, he professed to pay, if not exactly conspicuous at least noticeable and intentional attention to those other girls who were always so interested in him and who always, as she had been constantly imagining, were but waiting for any slight overture on his part, to yield themselves to him in any way that he might dictate. Now he was looking over the shoulder of Rusa Nikifrich, her plump face with its snub nose and weak chin turned engagingly toward him, and he commenting on something not particularly connected with the work in hand apparently, for both were idly smiling. Again, in a little while, he was by the side of Martha Bordeaux, her plump French shoulders and arms bare to the pits next to his. And for all her fleshy solidity and decidedly foreign flavor, there was still enough about her which most men would like. And with her Clyde was attempting to jest, too. And later it was Flora Brandt, the very sensuous and not unpleasing American girl whom Roberta had seen Clyde cultivating from time to time. Yet, even so, she had never been willing to believe that he might become interested in any of these. Not Clyde, surely. And yet he could not see her at all now, could not find time to say a single word, although all these pleasant words and gay looks for all these others. Oh, how bitter! Oh, how cruel! And how utterly she despised those other girls with their oglings and their open attempts to take him from her. Oh, how terrible! Surely he must be very opposed to her now, otherwise he could not do this, and especially after all that had been between them, the love, the kisses. The hours dragged for both, and with as much poignance for Clyde as for Roberta. For his was a feverish, urgent disposition where his dreams were concerned, and could ill brook the delay or disappointments that are the chief and outstanding characteristics of the ambitions of men, whatever their nature. He was tortured hourly by the thought that he was to lose Roberta or that to win her back he would have to succumb to her wishes. And on her part she was torn, not so much by the question as to whether she would have to yield in this matter, for by now that was almost the least of her worries, but whether, once so yielding, Clyde would be satisfied with just some form of guarded social contact in the room, or not. And so continue on the strength of that to be friends with her. For more than this she would not grant, never. And yet, this suspense. The misery of his indifference. She could scarcely endure it from minute to minute, let alone from hour to hour, and finally in an agony of dissatisfaction with herself at having brought all this on herself, she retired to the rest room at about 3 in the afternoon and there with the aid of a piece of paper found on the floor and a small bit of pencil which she had, she composed a brief note. Please, Clyde, don't be mad at me, will you? Please don't. Please look at me and speak to me, won't you? I'm so sorry about last night, really I am, terribly. And I must see you tonight at the end of Elm Street at 8:30 if you can, will you? I have something to tell you. Please do come. And please do look at me and tell me you will, even though you are angry. You won't be sorry. I love you so. You know I do. You're sorrowful, Roberta. And in the spirit of one who is in agonized search for an opiate, she folded up the paper and returning to the room, drew close to Clyde's desk. He was before it at the time, bent over Sum's lips. And quickly as she passed she dropped the paper between his hands. He looked up instantly, his dark eyes still hard at the moment with the mingled pain and unrest and dissatisfaction and determination that had been upon him all day, and noting Roberta's retreating figure as well as the note, he at once relaxed, a wave of puzzled satisfaction as well as delight instantly filled him. He opened it and read. And as instantly his body was suffused with a warm and yet very weakening ray. And Roberta in turn, having reached her table and paused to note if by any chance anyone had observed her, now looked cautiously about, a strained and nervous look in her eyes. But seeing Clyde looking directly at her, his eyes filled with a conquering and yet yielding light and a smile upon his lips, and his head nodding a happy assent, she as suddenly experienced a dizzying sensation, as though her hitherto constricted blood, detained by a constricted heart and constricted nerves, were as suddenly set free. And all the dry marshes and cracked and parched banks of her soul, the dry rivulets and streams and lakes of misery that seemed to dot her being, were as instantly flooded with this rich upwelling force of life and love. He would meet her. They would meet tonight. He would put his arms around her and kiss her as before. She would be able to look in his eyes. They would not quarrel any more, oh, never if she could help it. Chapter 22. The wonder and delight of a new and more intimate form of contact, of protest gainsaid, of scruples overcome. Days, when both, having struggled in vain against the greater intimacy which each knew that the other was desirous of yielding to, and eventually so yielding, looked forward to the approaching night with an eagerness which was as a fever embodying a fear. For with what qualms, what protests on the part of Roberta, what determination, yet not without a sense of evil, seduction, betrayal, on the part of Clyde. Yet the thing once done, a wild convulsive pleasure motivating both. Yet, not without, before all this, an exaction on the part of Roberta to the effect that never, come what might, the natural consequences of so wild an intimacy strong in her thoughts, would he desert her, since without his aid she would be helpless. Yet, with no direct statement as to marriage. And he, so completely overcome and swayed by his desire, thoughtlessly protesting that he never would, never. She might depend on that, at least, although even then there was no thought in his mind of marriage. He would not do that. Yet nights and nights, all scruples for the time being abandoned, and however much by day Roberta might brood and condemn herself, when each yielded to the other completely. And dream thereafter, recklessly and wildly, of the joy of it, wishing from day to day for the time being that the long day might end, that the concealing, rewarding feverish night were at hand. And Clyde feeling, and not unlike Roberta, who was firmly and even painfully convinced of it, that this was sin, deadly, mortal, since both his mother and father had so often emphasized that, the seducer, adulterer, who prays outside the sacred precincts of marriage. And Roberta, peering nervously into the blank future, wondering what, how, in any case, by any chance, Clyde should change, or fail her. Yet the night returning, her mood once more veering, and she as well as he hurrying to meet somewhere, only later, in the silence of the middle night, to slip into this unlighted room which was proving so much more of a paradise than either might ever know again, so wild and unrecapturable is the fever of youth. And, at times, and despite all his other doubts and fears, Clyde, because of this sudden abandonment by Roberta of herself to his desires, feeling for the first time, really, in all his feverish years, that at last he was a man of the world, one who was truly beginning to know women. And so taking to himself an air or manner that said as plainly as might have any words, "Behold, I am no longer the inexperienced, neglected simpleton of but a few weeks ago, but an individual of import now, someone who knows something about life. What have any of these strutting young men, and gay, coaxing, flirting girls all about me, that I have not? And if I chose, were less loyal than I am, what might I not do?" And this was proving to him that the notion which Hortense Briggs, to say nothing of the more recent fiasco in connection with Rita, had tended to build up in his mind, that he was either unsuccessful or ill-fated where girls were concerned, was false. He was after all, and despite various failures and inhibitions, a youth of the Don Juan or Lothario stripe. And if now Roberta was obviously willing to sacrifice herself for him in this fashion, must there not be others? And this, in spite of the present indifference of the Griffiths, caused him to walk with even more of an air than had hitherto characterized him. Even though neither they nor any of those connected with them recognized him, still he looked at himself in his mirror from time to time with an assurance and admiration which before this he had never possessed. For now Roberta, feeling that her future was really dependent on his will and whim, had set herself to flatter him almost constantly, to be as obliging and convenient to him as possible. Indeed, According to her notion of the proper order of life, she was now his and his only, as much as any wife is ever to a husband, to do with as he wished. And for a time therefore, Clyde forgot his rather neglected state here and was content to devote himself to her without thinking much of the future. The one thing that did trouble him at times was the thought that possibly, in connection with the original fear she had expressed to him, something might go wrong, which, considering her exclusive devotion to him, might prove embarrassing. At the same time he did not trouble to speculate too deeply as to that. He had Roberta now. These relations, in so far as either of them could see, or guess, were a dark secret. The pleasures of this left-handed honeymoon were at full tide. And the remaining brisk and often sunshiny and warm November and first December days passed, as in a dream, really, an ecstatic paradise of sorts in the very center of a humdrum conventional and petty and underpaid workaday world. In the meantime the Griffiths had been away from the city since the middle of June, and ever since their departure Clyde had been meditating upon them and all they represented in his life and that of the city. Their great house closed and silent, except for gardeners and an occasional chauffeur or servant visible as he walked from time to time past the place, was the same as a shrine to him, nearly, the symbol of that height to which by some turn of fate he might still hope to attain. For he had never quite been able to expel from his mind the thought that his future must in some way be identified with the grandeur that was here laid out before him. Yet so far as the movements of the Griffiths family and their social peers outside Lycurgus were concerned, he knew little other than that which from time to time he had read in the society columns of the two local papers, which almost obsequiously pictured the comings and goings of all those who were connected with the more important families of the city. At times, after reading these accounts, he had pictured to himself, even when he was off somewhere with Roberta at some unheralded resort, Gilbert Griffiths racing in his big car, Bella, Bertine and Sandra dancing, canoeing in the moonlight, playing tennis, riding at some of the smart resorts where they were reported to be. The thing had had a bite and ache for him that was almost unendurable, and had lit up for him at times and with overwhelming clarity this connection of his with Roberta. For after all, who was she? A factory girl. The daughter of parents who lived and worked on a farm, and one who was compelled to work for her own living. Whereas he, if fortune would but favor him a little. Was this to be the end of all his dreams in connection with his prospective superior life here? So it was that at moments and in his darker moods, and especially after she had abandoned herself to him, his thoughts ran. She was not of his station, really, at least not of that of the Griffiths to which still he most eagerly aspired. Yet at the same time, whatever the mood generated by such items as he read in the Star, he would still return to Roberta, picturing her, since the other mood which had drawn him to her had by no means palled as yet, as delightful, precious, exceedingly worthwhile from the point of view of beauty, pleasure, sweetness, the attributes and charms which best identify any object of delight. But the Griffiths and their friends having returned to the city, and Lycurgus once more taken on that brisk, industrial and social mood which invariably characterized it for at least 7 months in the year, he was again, and even more vigorously than before, intrigued by it. The beauty of the various houses along Waikiki Avenue and its immediate tributaries. The unusual and intriguing sense of movement and life there so much in evidence. Oh, if he were but of it. Chapter 23. And then, one November evening as Clyde was walking along Waikiki Avenue, just west of Central, a portion of the locally celebrated avenue which, ever since he had moved to Mrs. Peyton's, he was accustomed to traverse to and from his work, one thing did occur which insofar as he and the Griffiths were concerned was destined to bring about a chain of events which none of them could possibly have foreseen. At the time there was in his heart and mind that singing which is the inheritance of youth and ambition, and which the dying of the old year, instead of depressing, seemed but to emphasize. He had a good position. He was respected here. Over and above his room and board he had not less than $15 a week to spend on himself and Roberta, an income which, while it did not parallel that which had been derived from the Green Davidson or the Union League, was still not so involved with family miseries in the one place or personal loneliness in the other. And he had Roberta secretly devoted to him. And the Griffiths, thank goodness, did not and should not know anything of that, though just how in case of a difficulty it was to be avoided, he was not even troubling to think. His was a disposition which did not tend to load itself with more than the most immediate cares. And although the Griffiths and their friends had not chosen to recognize him socially, still more and more all others who were not connected with local society and who knew of him, did. Only this very day, because the spring before he had been made a room chief, perhaps, and Samuel Griffiths had recently paused and talked with him, no less an important personage than Mr. Rudolph Smiley, one of the several active vice presidents, had asked him most cordially and casually whether he played golf, and if so, when spring came again, whether he might not be interested to join the Amoskeag, one of the two really important golf clubs within a half-dozen miles of the city. Now, what could that mean, if not that Mr. Smiley was beginning to see him as a social possibility, and that he as well as many others about the factory, were becoming aware of him as someone who was of some importance to the Griffiths, if not the factory. This thought, together with one other, that once more after dinner he was to see Roberta and in her room as early as 11 o'clock or even earlier, cheered him and caused him to step along most briskly and gaily. For, since having indulged in this secret adventure so many times, both were unconsciously becoming bolder. Not having been detected to date, they were of the notion that it was possible they might not be. Or if they were, Clyde might be introduced as her brother or cousin for the moment, anyhow, in order to avoid immediate scandal. Later, to avoid danger of comment or subsequent detection, as both had agreed after some discussion, Roberta might have to move to some other place where the same routine was to be repeated. But that would be easy, or at least better than no freedom of contact. And with that Roberta had been compelled to agree. However, on this occasion there came a contact and an interruption which set his thoughts careening in an entirely different direction. Reaching the first of the more important houses of Waikiki Avenue, although he had not the slightest idea who lived there, he was gazing interestedly at the high-wrought iron fence, as well as the kempt lawn within, dimly illuminated by street lamps, and upon the surface of which he could detect many heaps of freshly fallen brown leaves being shaken and rolled by a winnowing and gambling wind. It was also starkly severe, placid, reserved, beautiful, as he saw it, that he was quite stirred by the dignity and richness of it. And as he neared the central gate, above which two lights were burning, making a circle of light about it, a closed car of great size and solidity stopped directly in front of it. And the chauffeur stepping down and opening the door, Clyde instantly recognized Sandra Finchley leaning forward in the car. "Go around to the side entrance, David, and tell Miriam that I can't wait for her because I'm going over to the Trumbulls for dinner, but that I'll be back by 9. If she's not there, leave this note and hurry, will you?" The voice and manner were of that imperious and yet pleasing mode which had so intrigued him the spring before. At the same time seeing, as she thought, Gilbert Griffiths approaching along the sidewalk, she called, "Oh, hello. Walking tonight? If you want to wait a minute, you can ride out with me. I've just sent David in with a note. He won't be long." Now Sandra Finchley, despite the fact that she was interested in Bella and the Griffiths' wealth and prestige in general, was by no means as well pleased with Gilbert. He had been indifferent to her in the beginning when she had tried to cultivate him, and he had remained so. He had wounded her pride. And to her, who was overflowing with vanity and self-conceit, this was the last offense, and she could not forgive him. She could not and would not brook the slightest trace of ego in another, and most especially the vain, cold, self-centered person of Bella's brother. He had too fine an opinion of himself, as she saw it, was one who was too bursting with vanity to be of service to anyone. H.M.P. That stick. It was so that she invariably thought of him. Who does he think he is anyhow? He certainly does think he's a lot around here. You'd think he was a Rockefeller or a Morgan. And for my part I can't see where he's a bit interesting, anymore. I like Bella. I think she's lovely. But that smarty. I guess he would like to have a girl wait on him. Well, not for me. Such in the main were the comments made by Sandra upon such reported acts and words of Gilbert as were brought to her by others. And for his part, Gilbert, hearing of the gyrations, airs, and aspirations of Sandra from Bella from time to time, was accustomed to remark, "What, that little snip? Who does she think she is anyhow?" If ever there was a conceited little nut. However, so tightly were the social lines of Lycurgus drawn, so few the truly eligibles, that it was almost necessary and compulsory upon those in to make the best of such others as were in, and so it was that she now greeted Gilbert as she thought. And as she moved over slightly from the door to make room for him, Clyde, almost petrified by this unexpected recognition, and quite shaken out of his pose and self-contemplation, not being sure whether he had heard aright, now approached, his manner the epitome almost of a self-ingratiating and somewhat affectionate and wistful dog of high breeding and fine temperament. "Oh, good evening," he exclaimed, removing his cap and bowing. "How are you?" While his mind was registering that this truly was the beautiful, the exquisite Sandra whom months before he had met at his uncle's, and concerning whose social activities during the preceding summer he had been reading in the papers. And now here she was as lovely as ever, seated in this beautiful car and addressing him, apparently. However, Sandra, on the instant realizing that she had made a mistake and that it was not Gilbert, was quite embarrassed and uncertain for the moment just how to extricate herself from a situation which was a bit ticklish, to say the least. "Oh, pardon me, you're Mr. Clyde Griffiths, I see now. It's my mistake. I thought you were Gilbert. I couldn't quite make you out in the light." She had for the moment an embarrassed and fidgety and halting manner, which Clyde noticed and which he saw implied that she had made a mistake that was not entirely flattering to him nor satisfactory to her. And this in turn caused him to become confused and anxious to retire. "Oh, pardon me. But that's all right. I didn't mean to intrude. I thought." He flushed and stepped back really troubled. But now Sandra, seeing at once that Clyde was if anything much more attractive than his cousin and far more diffident, and obviously greatly impressed by her charms as well as her social state, unbent sufficiently to say with a charming smile, "But that's all right. Won't you get in, please, and let me take you where you are going?" "Oh, I wish you would. I will be so glad to take you." For there was that in Clyde's manner the instant he learned that it was due to a mistake that he had been recognized which caused even her to understand that he was hurt, abashed and disappointed. His eyes took on a hurt look and there was a wavering, apologetic, sorrowful smile playing about his lips. "Why, yes, of course," he said jerkily, "that is, if you want me to. I understand how it was. That's all right. But you needn't mind, if you don't wish to. I thought." He had half turned to go, but was so drawn by her that he could scarcely tear himself away before she repeated, "Oh, do come, get in, Mr. Griffiths. I'll be so glad if you will. It won't take David a moment to take you wherever you are going, I'm sure. And I am sorry about the other, really I am. I didn't mean, you know, that just because you weren't Gilbert Griffiths." He paused and in a bewildered manner stepped forward and entering the car, slipped into the seat beside her. And she, interested by his personality, at once began to look at him, feeling glad that it was he now instead of Gilbert. In order the better to see and again reveal her devastating charms, as she saw them, to Clyde, she now switched on the roof light. And the chauffeur returning, she asked Clyde where he wished to go, an address which he gave reluctantly enough, since it was so different from the street in which she resided. As the car sped on, he was animated by a feverish desire to make some use of this brief occasion which might cause her to think favorably of him, perhaps, who knows, lead to some faint desire on her part to contact him again at some time or other. He was so truly eager to be of her world. "It's certainly nice of you to take me up this way," he now turned to her and observed, smiling. "I didn't think it was my cousin you meant or I wouldn't have come up as I did." "Oh, that's all right. Don't mention it, replied Sandra archly with a kind of sticky sweetness in her voice. Her original impression of him, as she now felt, had been by no means so vivid. "It's my mistake, not yours. But I'm glad I made it now, anyhow," she added most definitely and with an engaging smile. "I think I'd rather pick you up than I would Gil, anyhow. We don't get along any too well, he and I. We quarrel a lot whenever we do meet anywhere." She smiled, having completely recovered from her momentary embarrassment, and now leaned back after the best princess fashion, her glance examining Clyde's very regular features with interest. He had such soft smiling eyes, she thought. And after all, as she now reasoned, he was Bella's and Gilbert's cousin, and looked prosperous. "Well, that's too bad," he said stiffly, and with a very awkward and weak attempt at being self-confident and even high-spirited in her presence. "Oh, it doesn't amount to anything, really. We just quarrel, that's all, once in a while." She saw that he was nervous and bashful and decidedly unresourceful in her presence, and it pleased her to think that she could thus befuddle and embarrass him so much. "Are you still working for your uncle?" "Oh, yes," replied Clyde quickly, as though it would make an enormous difference to her if he were not. "I have charge of a department over there now." "Oh, really? I didn't know. I haven't seen you at all, since that one time, you know. You don't get time to go about much, I suppose." She looked at him wisely, as much as to say, "Your relatives aren't so very much interested in you," but really liking him now, she said instead, "You have been in the city all summer, I suppose?" "Oh, yes," replied Clyde quite simply and winningly. "I have to be, you know. It's the work that keeps me here. But I've seen your name in the papers often, and read about your riding and tennis contests, and I saw you in that flower parade last June, too. I certainly thought you looked beautiful, like an angel almost." There was an admiring, pleading light in his eyes which now quite charmed her. What a pleasing young man, so different to Gilbert. And to think he should be so plainly and hopelessly smitten, and when she could take no more than a passing interest in him. It made her feel sorry, a little, and hence kindly toward him. Besides, what would Gilbert think if only he knew that his cousin was so completely reduced by her? How angry he would be, he, who so plainly thought her a snip. It would serve him just right if Clyde were taken up by someone and made more of than he, Gilbert, ever could hope to be. The thought had a most pleasing tang for her. However, at this point, unfortunately, the car turned in before Mrs. Peyton's door and stopped. The adventure for Clyde and for her was seemingly over. "That's awfully nice of you to say that. I won't forget that." She smiled archly as, the chauffeur opening the door, Clyde stepped down, his own nerves taut because of the grandeur and import of this encounter. "So this is where you live? Do you expect to be in Lycurgus all winter?" "Oh, yes. I'm quite sure of it. I hope to be anyhow," he added, quite yearningly, his eyes expressing his meaning completely. "Well, perhaps, then I'll see you again somewhere, sometime." "I hope so, anyhow." She nodded and gave him her fingers and the most fetching and wreathy of smiles, and he, eager to the point of folly, added, "Oh, so do I. Good night." "Good night," she called as the car sprang away, and Clyde, looking after it, wondered if he would ever see her again so closely and intimately as here. To think that he should have met her again in this way. And she had proved so very different from that first time when, as he distinctly recalled, she took no interest in him at all. He turned hopefully and a little wistfully toward his own door. And Sandra? Why was it, she pondered, as the motor car sped on its way, that the Griffiths were apparently not much interested in him? Chapter 24. The effect of this so casual contact was really disrupting in more senses than one. For now, in spite of his comfort and satisfaction with Roberta, once more and in this positive and to him entrancing way, was posed the whole question of his social possibilities here. And that strangely enough by the one girl of this upper level who had most materialized and magnified for him the meaning of that upper level itself. The beautiful Sandra Finchley. Her lovely face, smart clothes, gay and superior demeanor. If only at the time he had first encountered her he had managed to interest her. Or could now. The fact that his relations with Roberta were what they were now was not of sufficient import or weight to offset the temperamental or imaginative pull of such a girl as Sandra and all that she represented. Just to think the Wimbledon Finchley Electric Sweeper Company was one of the largest manufacturing concerns here. Its tall walls and stacks made a part of the striking skyline across the Mohawk. And the Finchley residence in Waikiki Avenue, near that of the Griffiths, was one of the most impressive among that distinguished row of houses which had come with the latest and most discriminating architectural taste here, Italian Renaissance, cream-hued marble and Dutchess County sandstone combined. And the Finchleys were among the most discussed of families here. Ah, to know this perfect girl more intimately. To be looked upon by her with favor, made, by reason of that favor, a part of that fine world to which she belonged. Was he not a Griffiths, as good-looking as Gilbert Griffiths any day? And as attractive if he only had as much money, or a part of it even. To be able to dress in the Gilbert Griffiths fashion, to ride around in one of the handsome cars he sported. Then, you bet, a girl like this would be delighted to notice him, mayhap, who knows, even fall in love with him. Angelskra and the tray of glasses. But now, as he gloomily thought, he could only hope. The devil. He would not go around to Roberta's this evening. He would trump up some excuse, tell her in the morning that he had been called upon by his uncle or cousin to do some work. He could not and would not go, feeling as he did just now. So much for the effect of wealth, beauty, the peculiar social state to which he most aspired, on a temperament that was as fluid and unstable as water. On the other hand, later, thinking over her contact with Clyde, Sandra was definitely taken with what may only be described as his charm for her, all the more definite in this case since it represented a direct opposite to all that his cousin offered by way of offense. His clothes and his manner, as well as a remark he had dropped, to the effect that he was connected with the company in some official capacity, seemed to indicate that he might be better placed than she had imagined. Yet she also recalled that although she had been about with Bella all summer and had encountered Gilbert, Myra and their parents from time to time, there had never been a word about Clyde. Indeed, all the information she had gathered concerning him was that originally furnished by Mrs. Griffiths, who had said that he was a poor nephew whom her husband had brought on from the West in order to help in some way. Yet now, as she viewed Clyde on this occasion, he did not seem so utterly unimportant or poverty-stricken by any means, quite interesting and rather smart and very attractive, and obviously anxious to be taken seriously by a girl like herself, as she could see. And this coming from Gilbert's cousin, a Griffiths, was flattering. Arriving at the Trumbulls, a family which centered about one Douglas Trumbull, a prosperous lawyer and widower and speculator of this region, who, by reason of his children as well as his own good manners and legal subtlety, had managed to ingratiate himself into the best circles of Lycurgus society, she suddenly confided to Jill Trumbull, the elder of the lawyer's two daughters, "You know, I had a funny experience today." And she proceeded to relate all that had occurred in detail. Afterward at dinner, Jill having appeared to find it most fascinating, she again repeated it to Gertrude and Tracy, the younger daughter and only son of the Trumbull family. "Oh, yes," observed Tracy Trumbull, a law student in his father's office, "I've seen that fellow, I bet, 3 or 4 times on Central Avenue. He looks a lot like Gil, doesn't he? Only not so swagger. I've nodded to him 2 or 3 times this summer because I thought he was Gil for the moment." "Oh, I've seen him, too," commented Gertrude Trumbull. "He wears a cap and a belted coat like Gilbert Griffiths, sometimes, doesn't he? Arabella Stark pointed him out to me once and then Jill and I saw him passing Stark's once on a Saturday afternoon. He is better looking than Gil, any day, I think." This confirmed Sandra in her own thoughts in regard to Clyde, and now she added, "Bertine Cranston and I met him one evening last spring at the Griffiths. We thought he was too bashful, then. But I wish you could see him now, he's positively handsome, with the softest eyes and the nicest smile. "Oh, now, Sandra," commented Jill Trumbull, who, apart from Bertine and Bella, was as close to Sandra as any girl here, having been one of her classmates at the Snedeker School. "I know someone who would be jealous if he could hear you say that. And wouldn't Gil Griffiths like to hear that his cousin's better looking than he is?" chimed in Tracy Trumbull. "Oh, he," sniffed Sandra irritably. "He thinks he's so much. I'll bet anything it's because of him that the Griffiths won't have anything to do with their cousin. I'm sure of it, now that I think of it. Bella would, of course, because I heard her say last spring that she thought he was good looking. And Myra wouldn't do anything to hurt anybody. What a lark if some of us were to take him up sometime and begin inviting him here and there, once in a while, you know, just for fun, to see how he would do. And how the Griffiths would take it. I know well enough it would be all right with Mr. Griffiths and Myra and Bella, but Gil I'll bet would be as peeved as anything. I couldn't do it myself very well, because I'm so close to Bella, but I know who could and they couldn't say a thing." She paused, thinking of Bertie Cranston and how she disliked Gil and Mrs. Griffiths. "I wonder if he dances or rides or plays tennis or anything like that?" She stopped and meditated amusedly, the while the others studied her. And Jill Trumbull, a restless, eager girl like herself, without so much of her looks or flair, however, observed, "It would be a prank, wouldn't it? Do you suppose the Griffiths really would dislike it very much?" "What's the difference if they did?" went on Sandra. "They couldn't do anything more than ignore him, could they? And who would care about that, I'd like to know? Not the people who invited him. Go on, you fellows, stir up a local scrap, will you?" put in Tracy Trumbull. "I'll bet anything that's what comes of it in the end. Gil Griffiths won't like it, you can gamble on that. I wouldn't if I were in his position. If you want to stir up a lot of feeling here, go to it, but I'll lay a bet that's what it comes to." Now Sandra Finchley's nature was of just such a turn that a thought of this kind was most appealing to her. However, as interesting as the idea was to her at the time, nothing definite might have come of it, had it not been that subsequent to this conversation and several others held with Bertie Cranston, Jill Trumbull, Patricia Anthony, and Arabella Stark, the news of this adventure, together with some comments as to himself, finally came to the ears of Gilbert Griffiths, yet only via Constance Wynant, to whom, as local gossips would have it, he was prospectively engaged. And Constance, hoping that Gilbert would marry her eventually, was herself irritated by the report that Sandra had chosen to interest herself in Clyde, and then, for no sane reason, as she saw it, proclaim that he was more attractive than Gilbert. So, as much to relieve herself as to lay some plan of avenging herself upon Sandra, if possible, she conveyed the whole matter in turn to Gilbert, who at once proceeded to make various cutting references to Clyde and Sandra. And these carried back to Sandra, along with certain embellishments by Constance, had the desired effect. It served to awaken in her the keenest desire for retaliation. For if she chose, she certainly could be nice to Clyde, and have others be nice to him, too. And that would mean perhaps that Gilbert would find himself faced by a social rival of sorts, his own cousin, too, who, even though he was poor, might come to be liked better. What a lark! At the very same time there came to her a way by which she might most easily introduce Clyde, and yet without seeming so to do, and without any great harm to herself, if it did not terminate as she wished. For unlike Hergus, among the younger members of those smarter families whose children had been to the Snedeker School, existed a rather illusory and casual dinner and dance club called the Now and Then. It had no definite organization, officers or abode. Anyone who, because of class and social connections, was eligible and chose to belong, could call a meeting of other members to give a dinner or dance or tea in their homes. And how simple, thought Sandra in browsing around for a suitable vehicle by which to introduce Clyde, if someone other than herself who belonged could be induced to get up something and then at her suggestion invite Clyde. How easy, say, for Jill Trumbull to give a dinner and dance to the Now and Thens, to which Clyde might be invited. And by this ruse she would thus be able to see him again and find out just how much he did interest her and what he was like. Accordingly, a small dinner for this club and its friends was announced for the first Thursday in December, Jill Trumbull to be the hostess. To it were to be invited Sandra and her brother, Stuart, Tracy, and Gertrude Trumbull, Arabella Stark, Bertine and her brother, and some others from Utica and Gloversville as well. And Clyde. But in order to safeguard Clyde against any chance of failure or even invidious comment of any kind, not only she but Bertine and Jill and Gertrude were to be attentive to and considerate of him. They were to see that his dance program was complete and that neither at dinner nor on the dance floor was he to be left to himself, but was to be passed on most artfully from one to the other until evening should be over. For, by reason of that, others might come to be interested in him, which would not only take the thorn from the thought that Sandra alone, of all the better people of Lycurgus, had been friendly to him, but would sharpen the point of this development for Gilbert, if not for Bella and the other members of the Griffiths family. And in accordance with this plan, so it was done. And so it was that Clyde, returning from the factory one early December evening about 2 weeks after his encounter with Sandra, was surprised by the sight of a cream-colored note leaning against the mirror of his dresser. It was addressed in a large, scrawly and unfamiliar hand. He picked it up and turned it over without being able in any way to fix upon the source. On the back were the initials B. T. or J. T. He could not decide which, so elaborately intertwined was the engraved penmanship. He tore it open and drew out a card which read, "The Now and Then Club will hold its first winter dinner dance at the home of Douglas Trumbull 135 Waikiki Avenue on Thursday, December 4th. You are cordially invited. Will you kindly reply to Miss Jill Trumbull?" On the back of this, though, in the same scrawly hand that graced the envelope was written, "Dear Mr. Griffiths, thought you might like to come. It will be quite informal. And I'm sure you'll like it. If so, will you let Jill Trumbull know? Sandra Finchley." Quite amazed and thrilled, Clyde stood and stared. For ever since that second contact with her, he had been more definitely fascinated than at any time before by the dream that somehow, in some way, he was to be lifted from the lowly state in which he now dwelt. He was, as he now saw it, really too good for the commonplace world by which he was environed. And now here was this, a social invitation issued by the Now and Then Club, of which, even though he had never heard of it, must be something since it was sponsored by such exceptional people. And on the back of it, was there not the writing of Sandra herself? How marvelous, really! So astonished was he that he could scarcely contain himself for joy, but now on the instant must walk to and fro, looking at himself in the mirror, washing his hands and face, then deciding that his tie was not just right, perhaps, and changing to another, thinking forward to what he should wear and back upon how Sandra had looked at him on that last occasion. And how she had smiled. At the same time he could not help wondering even at this moment of what Roberta would think, if now, by some extra optical power of observation she could note his present joy in connection with this note. For plainly, and because he was no longer governed by the conventional notions of his parents, he had been allowing himself to drift into a position in regard to her which would certainly spell torture to her in case she should discover the nature of his present mood, a thought which puzzled him not a little, but did not serve to modify his thoughts in regard to Sandra in the least. That wonderful girl. That beauty. That world of wealth and social position she lived in. At the same time so innately pagan and unconventional were his thoughts in regard to all this that he could now ask himself, and that seriously enough, why should he not be allowed to direct his thoughts toward her and away from Roberta, since at the moment Sandra supplied the keener thought of delight. Roberta could not know about this. She could not see into his mind, could she, become aware of any such extra experience as this unless he told her. And most assuredly he did not intend to tell her. And what harm, he now asked himself, was there in a poor youth like himself aspiring to such heights? Other youths as poor as himself had married girls as rich as Sandra. For in spite of all that had occurred between him and Roberta he had not, as he now clearly recalled, given her his word that he would marry her except under one condition. And such a condition, especially with the knowledge that he had all too clearly acquired in Kansas City, was not likely to happen as he thought. And Sandra, now that she had thus suddenly burst upon him again in this way, was the same as a fever to his fancy. This goddess in her shrine of gilt and tinsel, so utterly enticing to him, had deigned to remember him in this open and direct way and to suggest that he be invited. And no doubt she, herself, was going to be there, a thought which thrilled him beyond measure. And what would not Gilbert and the Griffiths think if they were to hear of his going to this affair now, as they surely would? Or meet him later at some other party to which Sandra might invite him? Think of that. Would it irritate or please them? Make them think less or more of him? For, after all, this certainly was not of his doing. Was he not properly invited by people of their own station here in Lycurgus whom most certainly they were compelled to respect? And by no device of his, either, sheer accident, the facts concerning which would most certainly not reflect on him as pushing. As lacking as he was in some of the finer shades of mental discrimination, a sly and ironic pleasure lay in the thought that now Gilbert and the Griffiths might be compelled to countenance him whether they would or not, invite him to their home, even. For, if these others did, how could they avoid it, really? Oh, joy! And that in the face of Gilbert's high contempt for him. He fairly chuckled as he thought of it, feeling that however much Gilbert might resent it, neither his uncle nor Myra were likely to, and that hence he would be fairly safe from any secret desire on the part of Gilbert to revenge himself on him for this. But how wonderful this invitation! Why that intriguing scribble of Sandra's unless she was interested in him some? Why? The thought was so thrilling that Clyde could scarcely eat his dinner that night. He took up the card and kissed the handwriting. And instead of going to see Roberta as usual, he decided as before on first re-encountering her, to walk a bit, then return to his room, and retire early. And on the morrow as before he could make some excuse, say that he had been over to the Griffiths' home, or some one of the heads of the factory, in order to listen to an explanation in regard to something in connection with the work, since there were often such conferences. For, in the face of this, he did not care to see or talk to Roberta this night. He could not. The other thought, that of Sandra and her interest in him, was too enticing. Chapter 25. But in the interim, in connection with his relations with Roberta, no least reference to Sandra, although, even when near her in the factory or her room, he could not keep his thoughts from wandering away to where Sandra in her imaginary high social world might be. The while Roberta, at moments only sensing a drift and remoteness in his thought and attitude which had nothing to do with her, was wondering what it was that of late was beginning to occupy him so completely. And he, in his turn, when she was not looking, was thinking, supposing, since she had troubled to recall herself to him, that he could interest a girl like Sandra in him. What then of Roberta? What? And in the face of this intimate relation that had now been established between them. Goodness! The deuce, and that he did care for her, yes, he did, although now, basking in the direct rays of this newer luminary, he could scarcely see Roberta any longer, so strong were the actinic rays of this other. Was he all wrong? Was it evil to be like this? His mother would say so. And his father too, and perhaps everybody who thought right about life. Sandra Finchley, maybe, the Griffiths, all. And yet. It was snowing, the first light snow of the year, as Clyde, arrayed in a new collapsible silk hat and white silk muffler, both suggested by a friendly haberdasher, or in short, with whom recently he had come in contact here, and a new silk umbrella wherewith to protect himself from the snow, made his way toward the very interesting, if not so very imposing residence of the Trumbulls on Waikiki Avenue. It was quaint, low and rambling, and the lights beaming from within upon the many drawn blinds gave it a Christmas card effect. And before it, even at the prompt hour at which he arrived, were ranged a half-dozen handsome cars of various builds and colors. The sight of them, sprinkled on tops, running boards and fenders with the fresh, flaky snow, gave him a keen sense of a deficiency that was not likely soon to be remedied in his case, the want of ample means wherewith to equip himself with such a necessity as that. And inside, as he approached the door, he could hear voices, laughter and conversation commingled. A tall, thin servant relieved him of his hat, coat and umbrella, and he found himself face to face with Jill Trumbull, who apparently was on the lookout for him, a smooth, curly-haired blonde girl, not too thrillingly pretty, but brisk and smart, in white satin with arms and shoulders bare and rhinestones banded around her forehead. "No trouble to tell who you are," she said gaily, approaching and giving Clyde her hand. "I'm Jill Trumbull. Miss Finchley hasn't come yet. But I can do the honors just as well, I guess. Come right in where the rest of us are." She led the way into a series of connecting rooms that seemed to join each other at right angles, adding as she went, "You do look an awful lot like Gil Griffiths, don't you?" "Do I?" smiled Clyde simply and courageously, and very much flattered by the comparison. The ceilings were low. Pretty lamps behind painted shades hugged dark walls. Open fires in 2 connecting rooms cast a rosy glow upon cushioned and comfortable furniture. There were pictures, books, objects of art. "Here, Tracy, you do the announcing, will you?" she called. "My brother, Tracy Trumbull, Mr. Griffiths. Mr. Clyde Griffiths, everybody," she added, surveying the company in general, which in turn fixed varying eyes upon him, while Tracy Trumbull took him by the hand. Clyde, suffering from a sense of being studied, nevertheless achieved a warm smile. At the same time he realized that for the moment at least conversation had stopped. "Don't all stop talking on my account," he ventured, with a smile, which caused most of those present to conceive of him as at his ease and resourceful. At the same time Tracy added, "I'm not going to do any man-to-man introduction stuff. We'll stand right here and point 'em out. That's my sister, Gertrude, over there talking to Scott Nicholson." Clyde noted that a small, dark girl dressed in pink with a pretty and yet saucy and piquant face, nodded to him. And beside her a very de rigueur youth of fine physique and pink complexion nodded jerkily. "How'd you do?" And a few feet from them near a deep window stood a tall and yet graceful girl of dark and by no means ravishing features talking to a broad-shouldered and deep-chested youth of less than her height, who were proclaimed to be Arabella Stark and Frank Harriet. They're arguing over a recent Cornell-Syracuse football game. Burchard Taylor and Miss Fent of Utica, he went on almost too swiftly for Clyde to assemble any mental notes. Pearlie Haynes and Miss Van de Steel. "Well, I guess that's all as yet. Oh, no, here come Grant and Nina Temple." Clyde paused and gazed as a tall and somewhat dandified-looking youth, sharp of face and with murky gray eyes, steered a trim, young, plump girl in fawn gray and with a light chestnut braid of hair laid carefully above her forehead, into the middle of the room. "Hello, Jill. Hello, Vanda. Hello, Wynette." In the midst of these greetings on his part, Clyde was presented to these two, neither of whom seemed to pay much attention to him. "Didn't think we'd make it," went on young Cranston, speaking to all at once. "Nina didn't want to come, but I promised Bertine and Jill or I wouldn't have, either. We were up at the Bagels. Guess who's up there, Scott? Van Peterson and Rhoda Hull. They're just over for the day." "You don't say?" called Scott Nicholson, a determined and self-centered looking individual. Clyde was arrested by the very definite sense of social security and ease that seemed to reside in everybody. "Why didn't you bring him along? I'd like to see Rhoda again and Van, too." "Couldn't. They have to go back early, they say. They may stop in later for a minute. Gee, isn't dinner served yet? I expected to sit right down. These lawyers. Don't you know they don't eat often?" commented Frank Harriet, who was a short, but broad-chested and smiling youth, very agreeable, very good-looking and with even, white teeth. Clyde liked him. "Well, whether they do or not, we do, or out I go. Did you hear who is being touted for stroke next year over at Cornell?" This college chatter relating to Cornell and shared by Harriet, Cranston and others, Clyde could not understand. He had scarcely heard of the various colleges with which this group was all too familiar. At the same time, he was wise enough to sense the defect and steer clear of any questions or conversations which might relate to them. However, because of this, he at once felt out of it. These people were better informed than he was, had been to colleges. Perhaps he had better claim that he had been to some school. In Kansas City he had heard of the State University of Kansas, not so very far from there. Also the University of Missouri. And in Chicago of the University of Chicago. Could he say that he had been to one of those, that Kansas one, for a little while, anyway? On the instant he proposed to claim it, if asked, and then look up afterwards what, if anything, he was supposed to know about it, what, for instance, he might have studied. He had heard of mathematics somewhere. Why not that? But these people, as he could see, were too much interested in themselves to pay much attention to him now. He might be a Griffiths and important to some outside, but here not so much, a matter of course, as it were. And because Tracy Trumbull for the moment had turned to say something to Winnet Fent, he felt quite alone, beached and helpless and with no one to talk to. But just then the small, dark girl, Gertrude, came over to him. The crowd's a little late in getting together. It always is. If we said 8, they'd come at 8:30 or 9. Isn't that always the way? It certainly is, replied Clyde gratefully, endeavoring to appear as brisk and as much at ease as possible. I'm Gertrude Trumbull, she repeated. The sister of the good-looking Jill. A cynical and yet amused smile played about her mouth and eyes. You nodded to me, but you don't know me. Just the same, we've been hearing a lot about you. She teased in an attempt to trouble Clyde a little, if possible. A mysterious Griffiths here in Lycurgus whom no one seems to have met. I saw you once in Central Avenue, though. You were going into Rich's candy store. You didn't know that, though. Do you like candy? Oh, yes, I like candy. Why? Asked Clyde on the instant, feeling teased and disturbed, since the girl for whom he was buying the candy was Roberta. At the same time he could not help feeling slightly more at ease with this girl than with some others, for although cynical and not so attractive, her manner was genial and she now spelled escape from isolation and hence diffidence. You're probably just saying that, she laughed, a bantering look in her eyes. More likely you were buying it for some girl. You have a girl, haven't you? Why? Clyde paused for the fraction of a second because as she asked this Roberta came into his mind and the query, had anyone ever seen him with Roberta? Flitted through his brain. Also thinking at the same time, what a bold, teasing, intelligent girl this was, different from any that thus far he had known. Yet quite without more pause he added, no, I haven't. What makes you ask that? As he said this there came to him the thought of what Roberta would think if she could hear him. But what a question, he continued a little nervously now. You like to tease, don't you? Who, me? Oh, no. I wouldn't do anything like that. But I'm sure you have just the same. I like to ask questions sometimes, just to see what people will say when they don't want you to know what they really think. She beamed into Clyde's eyes amusedly and defiantly. But I know you have a girl just the same. All good-looking fellows have. Oh, am I good-looking? He beamed nervously, amused and yet pleased. Who said so? As though you didn't know. Well, different people. I for one. And Sandra Finchley thinks you're good-looking, too. She's only interested in men who are. So does my sister Jill, for that matter, and she only likes men who are good-looking. I'm different because I'm not so good-looking myself. She blinked cynically and teasingly into his eyes, which caused him to feel oddly out of place, not able to cope with such a girl at all, at the same time very much flattered and amused. But don't you think you're better looking than your cousin? She went on sharply and even commandingly. Some people think you are. Although a little staggered and yet flattered by this question which propounded what he might have liked to believe, and although intrigued by this girl's interest in him, still Clyde would not have dreamed of venturing any such assertion even though he had believed it. Too vividly it brought the aggressive and determined and even at times revengeful-looking features of Gilbert before him, who, stirred by such a report as this, would not hesitate to pay him out. "Why, I don't think anything of the kind," he laughed. "Honest, I don't. Of course I don't." "Oh, well, then maybe you don't, but you are just the same. But that won't help you much either, unless you have money, that is, if you want to run with people who have." She looked up at him and added quite blandly, "People like money even more than they do looks." What a sharp girl this was, he thought, and what a hard, cold statement. It cut him not a little, even though she had not intended that it should. But just then Sandra herself entered with some youth whom Clyde did not know, a tall, gangling, but very smartly dressed individual. And after them, along with others, Bertine and Stuart Finchley. "Here she is now," added Gertrude a little spitefully, for she resented the fact that Sandra was so much better looking than either she or her sister, and that she had expressed an interest in Clyde. "She'll be looking to see if you notice how pretty she looks, so don't disappoint her." The impact of this remark, a reflection of the exact truth, was not necessary to cause Clyde to gaze attentively, and even eagerly. For apart from her local position and means and taste in dress and manners, Sandra was of the exact order and spirit that most intrigued him, a somewhat refined, and because of means and position showered upon her, less savage, although scarcely less self-centered, Hortense Briggs. She was, in her small, intense way, a seeking Aphrodite, eager to prove to any who were sufficiently attractive the destroying power of her charm, while at the same time retaining her own personality and individuality free of any entangling alliance or compromise. However, for varying reasons which she could not quite explain to herself, Clyde appealed to her. He might not be anything socially or financially, but he was interesting to her. Hence she was now keen, first to see if he were present, next to be sure that he gained no hint that she had seen him first, and lastly to act as grandly as possible for his benefit, a Hortensian procedure and type of thought that was exactly the thing best calculated to impress him. He gazed and there she was, tripping here and there in a filmy chiffon dance frock, shaded from palest yellow to deepest orange, which most enhanced her dark eyes and hair. And having exchanged a dozen or more hellos, and references with one and another to this, that and the other local event, she at last condescended to evince awareness of his proximity. "Oh, here you are. You decided to come after all. I wasn't sure whether you would think it worthwhile. You've been introduced to everybody, of course?" She looked around as much as to say, that if he had not been she would proceed to serve him in this way. The others, not so very much impressed by Clyde, were still not a little interested by the fact that she seemed so interested in him. "Yes, I met nearly everybody, I think. Except Freddie Sells. He came in with me just now. Here you are, Freddie," she called to a tall and slender youth, smooth of cheek and obviously becurled as to hair, who now came over and in his closely fitting dress coat looked down on Clyde about as a spring rooster might look down on a sparrow. "This is Clyde Griffiths, I was telling you about, Fred," she began briskly. "Doesn't he look a lot like Gilbert?" "Why, you do at that," exclaimed this amiable person, who seemed to be slightly troubled with weak eyes since he bent close. "I hear you're a cousin of Gil's." "I know him well. We went through Princeton together. I used to be over here before I joined the General Electric over at Schenectady. But I'm around a good bit yet. You're connected with the factory, I suppose?" "Yes, I am," said Clyde, who, before a youth of obviously so much more training and schooling than he possessed, felt not a little reduced. He began to fear that this individual would try to talk to him about things which he could not understand, things concerning which, having had no consecutive training of any kind, he had never been technically informed. "In charge of some department, I suppose?" "Yes, I am," said Clyde, cautiously and nervously. "You know," went on Mr. Sells, briskly and interestingly, being of a commercial as well as technical turn, "I've always wondered just what, outside of money, there is to the collar business. Gil and I used to argue about that when we were down at college. He used to try to tell me that there was some social importance to making and distributing collars, giving polish and manner to people who wouldn't otherwise have them, if it weren't for cheap collars. I think he must have read that in a book somewhere. I always laughed at him. Clyde was about to attempt an answer, although already beyond his depth in regard to this. Social importance. Just what did he mean by that? Some deep, scientific information that he had acquired at college? He was saved a non-committal or totally uninformed answer by Sandra who, without thought or knowledge of the difficulty which was then and there before him, exclaimed, "Oh, no arguments, Freddie. That's not interesting. Besides, I want him to meet my brother and Bertine. You remember Miss Cranston? She was with me at your uncle's last spring." Clyde turned, while Fred made the best of the rebuff by merely looking at Sandra, whom he admired so very much. "Yes, of course," Clyde began, for he had been studying these two along with others. To him, apart from Sandra, Bertine seemed exceedingly attractive, though quite beyond his understanding also. Being involved, insincere and sly, she merely evoked in him a troubled sense of ineffectiveness, and hence uncertainty, insofar as her particular world was concerned, no more. "Oh, how do you do? It's nice to see you again," she drawled, the while her greenish-gray eyes went over him in a smiling and yet indifferent and quizzical way. She thought him attractive, but not nearly as shrewd and hard as she would have preferred him to be. "You've been terribly busy with your work, I suppose. But now that you've come out once, I suppose we'll see more of you here and there." "Well, I hope so," he replied, showing his even teeth. Her eyes seemed to be saying that she did not believe what she was saying and that he did not either, but that it was necessary, possibly amusing, to say something of the sort. And a related, though somewhat modified, version of this same type of treatment was accorded him by Stuart, Sandra's brother. "Oh, how do you do? Glad to know you. My sister has just been telling me about you. Going to stay in Lycurgus long? Hope you do. We'll run into one another once in a while then, I suppose." Clyde was by no means so sure, but he admired the easy, shallow way in which Stuart laughed and showed his even white teeth, a quick, genial, indifferent laugh. Also the way in which he turned and laid hold of Winnetfield's white arm as she passed. "Wait a minute, Win. I want to ask you something." He was gone, into another room, bending close to her and talking fast. And Clyde had noticed that his clothes were perfectly cut. What a gay world, he thought. What a brisk world. And just then Jill Trumbull began calling, "Come on, people. It's not my fault. The cook's mad about something and you're all late anyhow. We'll get it over with and then dance, eh? You can sit between me and Miss Trumbull when she gets the rest of us seated," assured Sandra. "Won't that be nice? And now you may take me in." She slipped a white arm under Clyde's and he felt as though he were slowly but surely being transported to paradise. Chapter 26. The dinner itself was chatter about a jumble of places, personalities, plans, most of which had nothing to do with anything that Clyde had personally contacted here. However, by reason of his own charm, he soon managed to overcome the sense of strangeness and hence indifference in some quarters, more particularly the young women of the group who were interested by the fact that Sandra Finchley liked him. And Jill Trumbull, sitting beside him, wanted to know where he came from, what his own home life and connections were like, why he had decided to come to Lycurgus, questions which, interjected as they were between silly banter concerning different girls and their beaux, gave Clyde pause. He did not feel that he could admit the truth in connection with his family at all. So he announced that his father conducted a hotel in Denver, not so very large, but still a hotel. Also that he had come to Lycurgus because his uncle had suggested to him in Chicago that he come to learn the collar business. He was not sure that he was wholly interested in it or that he would continue indefinitely unless it proved worthwhile, rather he was trying to find out what it might mean to his future, a remark which caused Sandra, who was also listening, as well as Jill, to whom it was addressed, to consider that in spite of all rumors attributed to Gilbert, Clyde must possess some means and position to which, in case he did not do so well here, he could return. This in itself was important, not only to Sandra and Jill, but to all the others. For, despite his looks and charm and family connections here, the thought that he was a mere nobody, seeking, as Constance Wynant had reported, to attach himself to his cousin's family, was disquieting. One couldn't ever be anything much more than friendly with a moneyless clerk or pensioner, whatever his family connections, whereas if he had a little money and some local station elsewhere, the situation was entirely different. And now Sandra, relieved by this and the fact that he was proving more acceptable than she had imagined he would, was inclined to make more of him than she otherwise would have done. "Are you going to let me dance with you after dinner?" was one of the first things he said to her, infringing on a genial smile given him in the midst of clatter concerning an approaching dance somewhere. "Why, yes, of course, if you want me to," she replied, coquettishly, seeking to intrigue him into further romanticisms in regard to her. "Just one? How many do you want? There are a dozen boys here, you know. Did you get a program when you came in? I didn't see any. Never mind. After dinner you can get one. And you may put me down for 3 and 8. That will leave you room for others." She smiled bewitchingly. "You have to be nice to everybody, you know." "Yes, I know." He was still looking at her. "But ever since I saw you at my uncle's last April, I've been wishing I might see you again. I always look for your name in the papers." He looked at her seekingly and questioningly, and in spite of herself, Sandra was captivated by this naive confession. Plainly he could not afford to go where or do what she did, but still he would trouble to follow her name and movements in print. She could not resist the desire to make something more of this. "Oh, do you?" she added. "Isn't that nice? But what do you read about me? That you were at 12th and Greenwood Lakes and up at Sharon for the swimming contests. I saw where you went up to Paul Smith's, too. The papers here seem to think you were interested in someone from Shroon Lake and that you might be going to marry him." "Oh, did they? How silly. The papers here always say such silly things." Her tone implied that he might be intruding. He looked embarrassed. This softened her, and after a moment she took up the conversation in the former vein. "Do you like to ride?" she asked sweetly and placatively. "I never have. You know I never had much chance at that, but I always thought I could if I tried. Of course, it's not hard. If you took a lesson or two you could, and," she added in a somewhat lower tone, "we might go for a canter sometime. There are lots of horses in our stable that you would like, I'm sure." Clyde's hair roots tingled anticipatorily. He was actually being invited by Sandra to ride with her sometime, and he could use one of her horses in the bargain. "Oh, I would love that," he said. "That would be wonderful." The crowd was getting up from the table. Scarcely anyone was interested in the dinner, because a chamber orchestra of 4 having arrived, the strains of a preliminary foxtrot were already issuing from the adjacent living room, a long, wide affair from which all obstructing furniture with the exception of wall chairs had been removed. "You had better see about your program and your dance before all the others are gone," cautioned Sandra. "Yes, I will right away," said Clyde, "but is 2 all I get with you? Well, make it 3, 5 and 8 then, in the first half." She waved him gaily away and he hurried for a dance card. The dances were all of the eager fox-trotting type of the period, with interpolations and variations according to the moods and temperaments of the individual dancers. Having danced so much with Roberta during the preceding month, Clyde was in excellent form and keyed to the breaking point by the thought that at last he was in social and even affectional contact with a girl as wonderful as Sandra. And although wishing to seem courteous and interested in others with whom he was dancing, he was almost dizzied by passing contemplations of Sandra. She swayed so droopily and dreamily in the embrace of Grant Cranston, the while without seeming to, looking in his direction when he was near, permitting him to sense how graceful and romantic and poetic was her attitude toward all things, What a flower of life she really was. And Nina Temple, with whom he was now dancing for his benefit, just then observed, "She is graceful, isn't she?" "Who?" asked Clyde, pretending an innocence he could not physically verify, for his cheek and forehead flushed. "I don't know who you mean." "Don't you? Then what are you blushing for?" He had realized that he was blushing. And that his attempted escape was ridiculous. He turned, but just then the music stopped and the dancers drifted away to their chairs. Sandra moved off with Grant Cranston and Clyde led Nina toward a cushioned seat in a window in the library. And in connection with Bertine with whom he next danced, he found himself slightly flustered by the cool, cynical aloofness with which she accepted and entertained his attention. Her chief interest in Clyde was the fact that Sandra appeared to find him interesting. "You do dance well, don't you? I suppose you must have done a lot of dancing before you came here, in Chicago, wasn't it, or where?" She talked slowly and indifferently. "I was in Chicago before I came here, but I didn't do so very much dancing. I had to work." He was thinking how such girls as she had everything, as contrasted with girls like Roberta, who had nothing. And yet, as he now felt in this instance, he liked Roberta better. She was sweeter and warmer and kinder, not so cold. When the music started again with the sonorous melancholy of a single saxophone interjected at times, Sandra came over to him and placed her right hand in his left and allowed him to put his arm about her waist, an easy, genial and unembarrassed approach which, in the midst of Clyde's dream of her, was thrilling. And then in her coquettish and artful way she smiled up in his eyes, a bland, deceptive and yet seemingly promising smile, which caused his heart to beat faster and his throat to tighten. Some delicate perfume that she was using thrilled in his nostrils as might have the fragrance of spring. "Having a good time?" "Yes, looking at you. When there are so many other nice girls to look at." "Oh, there are no other girls as nice as you. And I dance better than any other girl, and I'm much the best looking of any other girl here. Now, I've said it all for you. Now what are you going to say?" She looked up at him teasingly, and Clyde, realizing that he had a very different type to Roberta to deal with, was puzzled and flushed. "I see," he said, seriously. "Every fellow tells you that, so you don't want me to." "Oh, no, not every fellow." Sandra was at once intrigued and checkmated by the simplicity of his retort. "There are lots of people who don't think I'm very pretty." "Oh, don't they, though?" he returned quite gaily, for at once he saw that she was not making fun of him. And yet he was almost afraid to venture another compliment. Instead he cast about for something else to say, and going back to the conversation at the table concerning riding and tennis, he now asked, "You like everything out of doors and athletic, don't you?" "Oh, do I?" was her quick and enthusiastic response. "There isn't anything I like as much, really. I'm just crazy about riding, tennis, swimming, motorboating, aquaplaning." "You swim, don't you?" "Oh, sure," said Clyde, grandly. "Do you play tennis?" "Well, I've just taken it up," he said, fearing to admit that he did not play at all. "Oh, I just love tennis. We might play sometime together." Clyde's spirits were completely restored by this. And tripping as lightly as dawn to the mournful strains of a popular love song, she went right on. "Bella Griffiths and Stuart and Grant and I play fine doubles. We won nearly all the finals at Greenwood and 12th Lake last summer. And when it comes to aquaplaning and high diving you just ought to see me. We have the swiftest motorboat up at 12th Lake now, Stuart has. It can do 60 miles an hour." At once Clyde realized that he had hit upon the one subject that not only fascinated, but even excited her. For not only did it involve outdoor exercise, in which obviously she reveled, but also the power to triumph and so achieve laurels in such phases of sport as most interested those with whom she was socially connected. And lastly, although this was something which he did not so clearly realize until later, she was fairly dizzied by the opportunity all this provided for frequent changes of costume and hence social show, which was the one thing above all others that did interest her. How she looked in a bathing suit, a riding or tennis or dancing or automobile costume. They danced on together, thrilled for the moment at least, by this mutual recognition of the identity and reality of this interest each felt for the other, a certain momentary warmth or enthusiasm which took the form of genial and seeking glances into each other's eyes, hints on the part of Sandra that, assuming that Clyde could fit himself athletically, financially and in other ways for such a world as this, it might be possible that he would be invited here and there by her, broad and for the moment self-deluding notions on his part that such could and would be the case, while in reality just below the surface of his outward or seeming conviction and assurance ran a deeper current of self-distrust which showed as a decidedly eager and yet slightly mournful light in his eye, a certain vigor and assurance in his voice, which was nevertheless touched, had she been able to define it, with something that was not assurance by any means. "Oh, the dance is done," he said sadly. "Let's try to make them encore," she said, applauding. The orchestra struck up a lively tune and they glided off together once more, dipping and swaying here and there, harmoniously abandoning themselves to the rhythm of the music, like two small chips being tossed about on a rough but friendly sea. "Oh, I'm so glad to be with you again, to be dancing with you. It's so wonderful. Sandra. But you mustn't call me that, you know. You don't know me well enough. I mean Miss Finchley. But you're not going to be mad at me again, are you?" His face was very pale and sad again. She noticed it. "No. Was I mad at you? I wasn't really. I like you some. When you're not sentimental." The music stopped. The light dripping feet became walking ones. "I'd like to see if it's still snowing outside, wouldn't you?" It was Sandra asking. "Oh, yes. Let's go." Through the moving couples they hurried out a side door to a world that was covered thick with soft, cottony, silent snow. The air was filled with it silently eddying down. Chapter 27. The ensuing December days brought to Clyde some pleasing and yet complicating and disturbing developments. For Sandra Finchley, having found him so agreeable an admirer of hers, was from the first inclined neither to forget nor neglect him. But, occupying the rather prominent social position which she did, she was at first rather dubious as to how to proceed. For Clyde was too poor and decidedly too much ignored by the Griffiths themselves, even, for her to risk any marked manifestation of interest in him. And now, in addition to the primary motivating reason for all this, her desire to irritate Gilbert by being friends with his cousin, there was another. She liked him. His charm and his reverence for her and her station flattered and intrigued her. For hers was a temperament which required adulation in about the measure which Clyde provided it, sincere and romantic adulation. And at the very same time he represented physical as well as mental attributes which were agreeable to her, amorousness without the courage at the time, anyhow, to annoy her too much, reverence which yet included her as a very human being, a mental and physical animation which quite matched and companioned her own. Hence it was decidedly a troublesome thought with Sandra how she was to proceed with Clyde without attracting too much attention and unfavorable comment to herself, a thought which kept her sly little brain going at nights after she had retired. However, those who had met him at the Trumbulls were so much impressed by her interest in him that evening and the fact that he had proved so pleasing and affable, they in turn, the girls particularly, were satisfied that he was eligible enough. And in consequence, 2 weeks later, Clyde, searching for inexpensive Christmas presents in Starks for his mother, father, sisters, brother and Roberta, and encountering Jill Trumbull doing a little belated shopping herself, was invited by her to attend a pre-Christmas dance that was to be given the next night by Vanda Steele at her home in Gloversville. Jill herself was going with Frank Harriet and she was not sure but that Sandra Finchley would be there. Another engagement of some kind appeared to be in the way, but still she was intending to come if she could. But her sister Gertrude would be glad to have him escort her, a very polite way of arranging for Gertrude. Besides, as she knew, if Sandra heard that Clyde was to be there, this might induce her to desert her other engagement. "Tracy will be glad to stop for you in time," she went on, "or, She hesitated. "Perhaps you'd like to come over for dinner with us before we go. It'll be just the family, but we'd be delighted to have you. The dancing doesn't begin till 11. The dance was for Friday night, and on that night Clyde had arranged to be with Roberta because on the following day she was leaving for a 3-day over Christmas holiday visit to her parents, the longest stretch of time thus far she had spent away from him. And because, apart from his knowledge, she had arranged to present him with a new fountain pen and ever-sharp pencil, she had been most anxious that he should spend this last evening with her, a fact which she had impressed upon him. And he, on his part, had intended to make use of this last evening to surprise her with a white and black toilet set. But now, so thrilled was he at the possibility of a re-encounter with Sandra, he decided that he would cancel this last evening engagement with Roberta, although not without some misgivings as to the difficulty as well as the decency of it. For despite the fact that he was now so lured by Sandra, nevertheless he was still deeply interested in Roberta and he did not like to grieve her in this way. She would look so disappointed, as he knew. Yet at the same time so flattered and enthused was he by this sudden, if tardy, social development that he could not now think of refusing Jill. What? Neglect to visit the Steeles in Gloversville and in company with the Trumbulls and without any help from the Griffiths, either? It might be disloyal, cruel, treacherous to Roberta, but was he not likely to meet Sandra? In consequence he announced that he would go, but immediately afterwards decided that he must go round and explain to Roberta, make some suitable excuse, that the Griffiths, for instance, had invited him for dinner. That would be sufficiently overawing and compelling to her. But upon arriving, and finding her out, he decided to explain the following morning at the factory, by note, if necessary. To make up for it he decided he might promise to accompany her as far as Fonda on Saturday and give her her present then. But on Friday morning at the factory, instead of explaining to her with the seriousness and even emotional dissatisfaction which would have governed him before, he now whispered, "I have to break that engagement tonight, honey. Been invited to my uncle's, and I have to go. And I'm not sure that I can get around afterwards. I'll try if I get through in time. But I'll see you on the Fonda cart tomorrow if I don't. I've got something I want to give you, so don't feel too bad. Just got word this morning or I'd have let you know. You're not going to feel bad, are you?" He looked at her as gloomily as possible in order to express his own sorrow over this. But Roberta, her presence and her happy last evening with him put aside in this casual way, and for the first time, too, in this fashion, shook her head negatively, as if to say oh, no, but her spirits were heavily depressed and she fell to wondering what this sudden desertion of her at this time might portend. For, up to this time, Clyde had been attentiveness itself, concealing his recent contact with Sandra behind a veil of pretended, unmodified affection which had, as yet, been sufficient to deceive her. It might be true, as he said, that an unescapable invitation had come up which necessitated all this. But, oh, the happy evening she had planned. And now they would not be together again for 3 whole days. She grieved dubiously at the factory and in her room afterwards, thinking that Clyde might at least have suggested coming around to her room late, after his uncle's dinner in order that she might give him the presents. But his eventual excuse made this day was that the dinner was likely to last too late. He could not be sure. They had talked of going somewhere else afterwards. But meanwhile Clyde, having gone to the Trumbulls, and later to the Steeles, was flattered and reassured by a series of developments such as a month before he would not have dreamed of anticipating. For at the Steeles he was promptly introduced to a score of personalities there who, finding him chaperoned by the Trumbulls and learning that he was a Griffiths, as promptly invited him to affairs of their own, or hinted at events that were to come to which he might be invited, so that at the close he found himself with cordial invitations to attend a New Year's dance at the Van Dams in Gloversville, as well as a dinner and dance that was to be given Christmas Eve by the Harriets in Lycurgus, an affair to which Gilbert and his sister Bella, as well as Sandra, Bertine and others were invited. And lastly, There was Sandra herself appearing on the scene at about midnight in company with Scott Nicholson, Freddie Sells, and Bertine, at first pretending to be wholly unaware of his presence, yet deigning at last to greet him with an, "Oh, hello, I didn't expect to find you here." She was draped most alluringly in a deep red Spanish shawl. But Clyde could sense from the first that she was quite aware of his presence, and at the first available opportunity he drew near to her and asked yearningly, "Aren't you going to dance with me at all?" "Why, of course, if you want me to." "I thought maybe you had forgotten me by now," she said mockingly. "As though I'd be likely to forget you. The only reason I'm here tonight is because I thought I might see you again. I haven't thought of anyone or anything else since I saw you last." Indeed, so infatuated was he with her ways and airs, that instead of being irritated by her pretended indifference, he was all the more attracted. And he now achieved an intensity which to her was quite compelling. His eyelids narrowed and his eyes lit with a blazing desire which was quite disturbing to see. "My, but you can say the nicest things in the nicest way when you want to." She was toying with a large Spanish comb in her hair for the moment and smiling. "And you say them just as though you meant them. Do you mean to say that you don't believe me, Sandra?" he inquired almost feverishly, this second use of her name thrilling her now as much as it did him. Although inclined to frown on so marked a presumption in his case, she let it pass because it was pleasing to her. "Oh, yes, I do. Of course," she said a little dubiously, and for the first time nervously, where he was concerned. She was beginning to find it a little hard to decipher her proper line of conduct in connection with him, whether to repress him more or less. "But you must say now what dance you want. I see someone coming for me." And she held her small program up to him archly and intriguingly. "You may have the 11th. That's the next after this." "Is that all?" "Well, and the 14th, then, greedy." She laughed into Clyde's eyes, a laughing look which quite enslaved him. Subsequently learning from Frank Harriet in the course of a dance that Clyde had been invited to his house for Christmas Eve, as well as that Jessica Fent had invited him to Utica for New Year's Eve, she at once conceived of him as slated for real success and decided that he was likely to prove less of a social burden than she had feared. He was charming, there was no doubt of it. And he was so devoted to her. In consequence, as she now decided, it might be entirely possible that some of these other girls, seeing him recognized by some of the best people here and elsewhere, would become sufficiently interested, or drawn to him even, to wish to overcome his devotion to her. Being of a vain and presumptuous disposition herself, she decided that that should not be. Hence, in the course of her second dance with Clyde, she said, "You've been invited to the Harriets for Christmas Eve, haven't you?" "Yes, and I owe it all to you, too," he exclaimed warmly. "Are you going to be there?" "Oh, I'm awfully sorry. I am invited and I wish now that I was going. But you know I arranged some time ago to go over to Albany and then up to Saratoga for the holidays. I'm going tomorrow, but I'll be back before New Year's. Some friends of Freddie's are giving a big affair over in Schenectady New Year's Eve, though. And your cousin Bella and my brother Stuart and Grant and Bertine are going. If you'd like to go, you might go along with us over there." She had been about to say me, but had changed it to us. She was thinking that this would certainly demonstrate her control over him to all those others, seeing that it nullified Miss Fent's invitation. And at once Clyde accepted, and with delight, since it would bring him in contact with her again. At the same time he was astonished and almost aghast over the fact that in this casual and yet very intimate and definite way she was planning for him to re-encounter Bella, who would at once carry the news of his going with her and these others to her family. And what would not that spell, seeing that even as yet the Griffiths had not invited him anywhere, not even for Christmas? For although the fact of Clyde having been picked up by Sandra in her car as well as later, that he had been invited to the Now and Then, had come to their ears, still nothing had been done. Gilbert Griffiths was wroth, his father and mother puzzled as to their proper course but remaining inactive nonetheless. But the group, according to Sandra, might remain in Schenectady until the following morning, a fact which she did not trouble to explain to Clyde at first. And by now he had forgotten that Roberta, having returned from her long stay at Bilt's by then, and having been deserted by him over Christmas, would most assuredly be expecting him to spend New Year's Eve with her. That was a complication which was to dawn later. Now he only saw bliss in Sandra's thought of him and at once eagerly and enthusiastically agreed. "But you know," she said cautiously, "you mustn't pay so very much attention to me over there or here or anywhere or think anything of it, if I don't to you. I may not be able to see so very much of you if you do. I'll tell you about that sometime. You see, my father and mother are funny people. And so are some of my friends here. But if you'll just be nice and sort of indifferent, you know, I may be able to see quite a little of you this winter yet. Do you see?" Thrilled beyond words by this confession, which came because of his too ardent approaches as he well knew, he looked at her eagerly and searchingly. "But you care for me a little, then, don't you?" he half demanded, half pleaded, his eyes lit with that alluring light which so fascinated her. And cautious and yet attracted, swayed sensually and emotionally and yet dubious as to the wisdom of her course, Sandra replied, "Well, I'll tell you. I do and I don't. That is, I can't tell yet. I like you a lot. Sometimes I think I like you more than others. You see, we don't know each other very well yet. But you'll come with me to Schenectady, though, won't you?" "Oh, will I? I'll write you more about that, or call you up. You have a telephone, haven't you?" He gave her the number. "And if by any chance there's any change or I have to break the engagement, don't think anything of it. I'll see you later, somewhere, sure." She smiled and Clyde felt as though he were choking. The mere thought of her being so frank with him, and saying that she cared for him a lot, at times, was sufficient to cause him to almost reel with joy. To think that this beautiful girl was so anxious to include him in her life if she could, this wonderful girl who was surrounded by so many friends and admirers from which she could take her pick,